Good morning and welcome to this news event hosted by the Our Transportation Future Coalition, or OTF for short. You'll be hearing from 5 speakers today, and then we will open the floor for questions during the Q&A period. The Q&A period will be for reporters only, and if those reporters wish to ask a question, you can use the raise your hand function at the bottom of your screen, and your line will be unmuted when it is your turn to ask a question. And to follow along today, you can find all of the regional and state poll results along with today's news release on the OTF website. You can go directly to www.ourtransportationfuture.org/TCI poll. Also, a direct link to this news release will be dropped in the chat window in a few minutes. And as I mentioned, you'll be hearing from 5 speakers today. Our first speaker today will be Allie Gold-Roberts, who's the Director of State Policy at Ceres. Our second speaker today will be Anthony Leiserwicz, who's the Director of the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication. Our third speaker today will be Phoebe Sweet, who is the Managing Director of Campaigns and Strategies at Nexus Polling. Our fourth speaker will be Brian O'Malley, President and CEO of the Central Maryland Transportation Alliance. And our fifth and final speaker today will be Lauren Bailey, who is the Director of Climate Policy at the Tri-State Transportation Campaign. But let's begin with our first speaker now. That is Allie Gold-Roberts, who's the Director of State Policy at Ceres. Allie, please take it away.
Good morning, and thank you for having me. It's my pleasure to speak on behalf of Ceres, a nonprofit advocacy organization working to transform the economy for people and the planet, and to introduce our Transportation Future Coalition. Our Transportation Future, or OTF, is a coalition of 80 local, regional, and national organizations, including Ceres, who are all committed to modernizing the transportation system across the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic region. TCI is a critical opportunity for the region to reduce transportation emissions and improve air quality, while also providing a significant source of funding for our crumbling transportation infrastructure, outdated transit system, and increase bike lanes, walkability, and much more. More than 100 businesses, investors, and higher education institutions, including Akamai, DHL, Eastern Connecticut State University, Haverford College, Lyft, Nestle, Novartis, State Street, and more, support TCI as a way to enable economic growth, invest in a modern transportation system, and improve public health. These businesses are calling on governors to develop an inclusive implementation process where rapid investments are made to expand clean transportation options, put people back to work, and prioritize emissions reductions in communities on the front lines of vehicle pollution. TCI will help improve air quality and drive down air pollution-related health problems. This is especially important as research shows that people exposed to smog may be more susceptible to the worst effects of COVID-19. This fall, Harvard T. Chan School of Public Health released a study illustrating the potential health benefit outcomes of TCI. Under the most ambitious cap on emissions, which the OTF coalition supports, the study found that up to 1,000 deaths and 5,000 asthma cases could be avoided annually by the year 2032. The study also linked increased exposure to vehicle emissions in overburdened and underserved communities to higher mortality rates from COVID-19, emphasizing the need to prioritize investments in these communities. We expect that when we see the MOU from states next week, it will include essential equity provisions. These provisions should include a commitment to invest in overburdened and underserved communities, as well as clear and inclusive processes to involve those communities in investment decisions. We credit the strong advocacy of local advocates that have been pushing to include these provisions, which are necessary for the success of TCI. Complementary policies such as air quality monitoring, data transparency, and emissions hotspots, and more will also be needed to build off of TCI and help close the gap on the persistent inequalities related to transportation pollution. We are expecting states in the region to finalize a memorandum of understanding for TCI, and this is an important step in program implementation, but it is by no means the final step. A core group of states will launch TCI, but additional states will be allowed to join at any time, following the example of other multi-state carbon pricing programs across the country. While TCI is a multi-state program, individual participating states will be able to engage with local stakeholders as state leaders determine how best to spend the revenue. While some states will have a legal requirement for legislative authorization on spending, we encourage the administrations from all participating states to gather input from a broad range of stakeholders. This will help ensure the program revenue is directed toward initiatives and programs that will both reduce emissions and alleviate the historical inequalities of transportation pollution. Thanks so much and look forward to talking about the polling.
Thanks. And again, that was Allie Gold Roberts, Director of State Policy at Ceres. Let's proceed to our second and third speakers today. Those are Anthony Leiserwicz, Director of the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication, and Phoebe Sweet, who is Managing Director of Campaigns and Strategies at Nexus Polling.
Great. Well, good morning, everyone. So just to reaffirm, my name is Anthony Leiserwicz. I'm a faculty member at the Yale School of the Environment, where I direct the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication. We were engaged to do a study of how do people across the TCI region respond to this set of proposals. But just to set a little bit of context here, I mean, to state perhaps the obvious, but to remind us of the obvious, you know, the nation in our region is currently confronting multiple and intersecting crises. A devastating pandemic, massive economic crisis, worsening climate change, critical equity and justice issues, and long overdue crumbling infrastructure. And I would say that more broadly, that in short, this study and other research shows pretty clearly that a majority of Americans are hurting and want bold, ambitious action by their leaders to solve these problems. So in this context, last month we conducted a representative survey of 3,818 registered voters in the 11 TCI states plus the District of Columbia to assess their support for big public investments in transportation, housing, water, energy, and broadband infrastructure, as well as efforts to reduce climate change and air pollution and accelerate the transition to clean energy and electric vehicles. And really the big takeaway is that voters in New England and the Mid-Atlantic strongly endorse bold state and regional action on all of these fronts. As I hope you've had a chance to at least look at some of the results, more than 7 out of 10 registered voters support their state participating in the Transportation and Climate Initiative. In particular, in the midst of this pandemic, they cite the critical need to ensure that essential workers be able to get to work safely and on time as their top priority. But they also strongly endorse a whole host of other reasons to invest in transportation infrastructure, including reducing air pollution and improving public transit. Also, I think importantly is that the context is that we're still in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. And in that experience of regional cooperation, because of course no state is an island, every state ultimately is intersected and connected by all of these systems, including in dealing with the pandemic. In that context, they strongly support their governor working with other governors in a regional approach to solving these shared problems. And then last thing I'll just say, from the perspective of a social scientist who's been studying public opinion about these issues for nearly 2 decades, I gotta say, it's really rare to see such a social consensus for an initiative like the TCI overall and for each of its components. I mean, we're finding huge majorities of voters support strong action to address all of these intersecting challenges. And I think that's one of the unique things about the TCI initiative, is that it's not just an individual state, it's not just an individual project, it's a multiple intersecting, multi-pronged approach being done at a scale where it can actually be effective, given that these are overlapping systems of transportation and energy and so on across the entire region. So with those preliminary remarks, I'd like to now turn it over to my colleague, Phoebe Sweet, who will share some more of the details from the regional results.
Thanks, Tony. So I'll walk you through the data, and first I'll go over opinions on the role of government in transportation. When it comes to state government investment in infrastructure, a majority of voters in TCI states say their state government isn't investing enough in repairing existing roads and bridges. Close to half say their state government isn't investing enough in affordable housing, reducing pollution, and preparing for the effects of climate change. Roughly 4 in 10 say their state government isn't investing enough in renewable energy, building new roads and bridges, and energy efficiency. Fewer say the same about broadband, water infrastructure, public transportation, electric vehicle charging infrastructure, and airports. Voters overall are split on whether their state government is prepared for the impacts of extreme weather on transportation infrastructure. 39% say their state is not prepared, while 38% say their state is prepared. By state, more than 4 in 10 in Connecticut and New Jersey say their state is not prepared, compared to about a third in Vermont, Delaware, Rhode Island, Maine, and the District of Columbia. More than 8 in 10 say it's important for their state to reduce carbon pollution at the local level, including nearly half who say it's very important. And this includes more than 9 in 10 Democrats, 8 in 10 independents, and nearly 7 in 10 Republicans. Voters across TCI states are more likely to approve of their governor's handling of COVID than of Trump's. 67% across all states approve of their governor's handling of COVID. And governors with particularly high marks include Larry Hogan of Maryland, Charlie Baker of Massachusetts, Phil Scott of Vermont, and Ned Lamont of Connecticut, as well as Mayor Muriel Bowser of DC. But while majorities in all of these states approve of how their governor has dealt with the pandemic, just 43% across these states approve of Trump's handling of the pandemic. And in just one state, Pennsylvania, does Trump reach 50% approval. 8 in 10, including at least 7 in 10 in every state, would support their governor working with other governors in the region on issues beyond the pandemic, such as expanding transportation. Support is highest in DC, Maryland, Massachusetts, Vermont, and New York, but at least 7 in 10 in Pennsylvania and Maine would support this as well. Roughly 3/4 agree that if the federal government fails to reduce the pollution that causes climate change, their state government should take action. And this holds true regardless of party. 86% of Democrats, 67% of independents, and 56% of Republicans agree. It also holds true across the states, at least 6 in 10 in every state, ranging from 64% in Maine to 75% in New York and Connecticut, and 78% in DC agree their state should take action if the federal government doesn't move on climate change. Next, I'll share some opinions on transportation in TCI states. When asked about the importance of various transportation objectives, nearly all say ensuring essential workers can get to work safely and on time is important, including fully 2/3 who say it's very important. A majority say reducing harmful pollution is a very important objective. And about half say reducing traffic congestion and ensuring low-income communities and communities of color have access to public transportation are also very important. And when asked how important various factors are in deciding what method of transportation they use, reliability, safety, and convenience top the list, with about 2/3 naming those as major factors. Majorities also identify cost and health as major factors, while fewer say speed, environmental impact, and accessibility for individuals with disabilities are major factors. Roughly 2/3 agree their state government should prioritize communities of color in investments in modernizing and upgrading transportation, including 8 in 10 Democrats, 56% of independents, and a plurality, nearly half, of Republicans. Finally, I'll share some opinions on TCI itself. More than 7 in 10 support their state participating in TCI, including 4 in 10 who strongly support their state joining. And majorities in every state support joining TCI, more than 8 in 10 in DC, 3/4 in New York and Maryland, about 7 in 10 in Massachusetts, New Jersey, and Vermont, about 2/3 in Connecticut and Virginia, and about 6 in 10 in Pennsylvania, Delaware, Rhode Island, and Maine. And when given 2 statements about TCI and the pandemic, 7 in 10 say their state should join TCI as part of the recovery from COVID. There's broad support for directing proceeds from TCI to a variety of infrastructure projects. At least 6 in 10 support each of the projects tested. 87% support direct funding to repairing existing roads and bridges, including 59% who strongly support this. Other objectives with strong support are investing in roads and bridges to make them climate resilient, expanding high-speed communications and internet, and improving the reliability of public transit. There's also strong support for incentives for electric vehicles, increasing frequency of public transportation, and EV charging infrastructure. And with that, I'll turn it back to Tony for a bit more context.
Thank you, Phoebe. And really just to kind of summarize, I mean, there's a reason why this is called the Transportation and Climate Initiative. And I think in broad brush terms, we see just overwhelming support for investments in a whole host of transportation related things, from changing infrastructure to, again, accelerating the move to clean energy and charging infrastructure across the region. But at the same time, we're seeing very strong support for action to address climate change and air pollution across the region, especially as it has consequences, disproportionate consequences for communities of color and that are otherwise disadvantaged. So overall, I think we really see again that there's very strong support for bold, ambitious action in this new context of the pandemic and the economic crisis. And with that, we'll turn it over.
Great. Again, that was Anthony Leiserwicz, director of the Yale program on climate change communication, and Phoebe Sweet, who's the managing director of campaigns and strategies at Nexus Polling. And that takes us to our fourth speaker today, which is Brian O'Malley. He's the president and CEO of the Central Maryland Transportation Alliance. Brian, take it away.
Good morning. So this polling data tells us that voters want their governors to take action to address the to address the transportation sector's role in causing the climate crisis. In Maryland, Governor Larry Hogan is popular in part because of his willingness to face crises like the COVID-19 pandemic and climate change and seek solutions even when the federal government isn't doing enough. When it comes to transportation, my organization, the Central Maryland Transportation Alliance, has at times been critical of our governor's priorities, but we are supportive of his leadership on the Transportation and Climate Initiative. And as this polling data shows us, we're not alone. While 70% of registered voters in the states developing TCI want their governor to go forward with the program, in Maryland, the figure is even higher, 75%. And that is partly because even before the pandemic, Marylanders were concerned about the climate crisis. The transportation sector is the #1 source of carbon pollution in Maryland. In Greater Baltimore, carbon emissions per capita were continuing to rise year over year, and something needed to be done. The pandemic has laid bare that while we depend on essential workers, they depend on public transportation. In Baltimore, 40% of regular transit riders are essential workers, many of them working in healthcare and food distribution. While some workers have been able to work remotely or drive, many continue to rely on public transportation during the pandemic. And so for our hospitals, our grocery stores, and other critical facilities to continue to function, we must have safe, reliable transit. The time to act is now. We're in multiple crises, as some of the speakers have mentioned. Like the voters in other states polled, Marylanders want to see their governor take action to reduce carbon pollution and ensure we have a transportation system that gets essential workers to work on time. We look to Governor Hogan as one of the leaders on the Transportation and Climate Initiative. He is one of the governors voters are looking to for action to help us be healthier, to help people in our communities get to work. Thank you.
Again, that was Brian O'Malley, president and CEO of the Central Maryland Transportation Alliance. And that takes us to our fifth and final speaker today, which is Lauren Bailey, Director of Climate Policy at Tri-State Transportation Campaign. Lauren?
Thank you so much. As the moderator said, my name is Lauren Bailey. I'm the Director of Climate Policy for Tri-State Transportation Campaign. Tri-State is a 27-year-old organization that focuses on 4 key goals: making transportation fair, fixing our commutes, eliminating pedestrian deaths, and particularly why we're here today, meeting our climate goals. This regional polling effort has really shown us that our voters, especially in the tri-state region of New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, are paying attention. For starters, many of my colleagues have said, 7 in 10 New Jersey and Connecticut voters and 8 in 10 New York voters support their state entering this TCI policy. They want our state leaders to do what they must to get away from this air pollution from our transportation sector. They see the need to eliminate dangerous emissions from cars and trucks to protect against the illnesses and deaths this pollution causes, including serious complications from COVID-19. Voters are aware that the states are not doing enough to prepare for the effects of climate change. Our entire region is interconnected, and we know that this regional effort is really important. And also, voters know how important our transportation system is for the people who can stay home right now, and as Brian said, for the essential workers who still need to get to work and to do their jobs effectively. Public transit in the region, which was battling through budget issues to transform to a cleaner and more effective system before the pandemic, is now facing such painful service cuts and layoffs that riders soon may have no choice but to find other ways to get around or be left stranded. The long-term health of our transit systems, as well as bolstering service and eliminating emissions, relies on a new longer-term funding solution. And this TCI policy is that integral starting point. And the scale of what needs to be done is immense. Current funding streams, such as Volkswagen settlement dollars, are only able to get us pilot projects and other starting points. The potential investment opportunities from this TCI policy are significantly more substantial, leading us to a place where we can make the plans on our shelves into our reality. Now is the time to implement proven ideas to fix our commutes, make transportation safer and cleaner, and clean our air overall. And the voters know that. The large threat of climate change, paired with the proven harm air pollution adds to the people who are battling COVID-19, means now is the time for transformative investment. And this TCI policy means that polluters pay for that transition. Our voters are paying attention. They want to see action from our governors, and we're very excited to see what happens next. Thank you so much for having me.
Again, that was Lauren Bailey, Director of Climate Policy at Tri-State Transportation Campaign. And that takes us to the Q&A portion of the call. If you wish to ask a question, use the raise your hand function and your line will be unmuted when it is your turn to ask a question. As a reminder, the Q&A period is for reporters only. If you're having issues with your own audio or the raise your hand function, you may also use the text-based Q&A box, and we'll do our best to get to all of those questions, but we will be taking the live questions first. And before we take our first question, I just want to mention that a video recording of this news event will be made available online at the OTF website, which is www.ourtransportationfuture.org. And you can find all of the polling results at the Our Transportation Future website that is linked to in the chat box, but you can also go directly to the URL, which is www.ourtransportationfuture.org/TCI poll. And before we take our first question, I just want to mention again that we're joined in the Q&A period by James Wyatt from Nexus Polling, who's going to be on to help answer questions related to polling data. Why don't we take our first question? Our first question comes from Barbara Moran with WBUR in Boston. Barbara, you mind unmuting your microphone?
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, great. Hi. So this is Barbara Moran with WBUR in Boston. So I noticed that the polling questions didn't indicate that there might be a cost increase at the pump for consumers. So I'm wondering if we need to take this sort of positive response with a grain of salt, given that people may not be familiar with the fact that it's likely that there'll be an increase in gas prices with TCI. So can you talk about why you didn't include that as part of the questioning?
So I can address at least part of that. So first of all, we didn't have the data in hand to be able to give people accurate estimates, but what I can say in broader terms, because we certainly asked lots of questions about this in many public surveys, is that I think when you do give people a sense of how much things will cost, support does drop a little bit, particularly among Republicans. But overall, we generally see that when people understand what the benefits are that they're going to get for these programs, they generally there's very strong support. So I mean, I've just never seen public support completely collapse, for example, when you help them understand how costs are going to be done. I think it's also important to say that this did describe the fact that gasoline companies would have to pay for the carbon pollution produced by the fuel they sell by purchasing these annual allowances. And we generally see, and again, this is in a broader survey context of many studies we've done nationally, is that there's just very strong support for requiring fossil fuel companies, including gas, oil, coal, et cetera, for paying for the pollution that they're producing. So, so yes, you're right. We did not ask a specific question in this survey with estimates of how much prices would go up at the pump because we just didn't have that data. But generally, we see that public support remains pretty high, even when you do provide those kinds of details.
Great. Why don't we take our next question? Just a second. Our next question comes from Bob C., who is from WGBH Public Radio in Boston. Bob, please make sure that you're unmuted. Bob, please go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me now?
We can.
Yeah, hi, Bob.
Okay, good. I'm just curious as to who was polled, if these are people at random who were chosen, and if so, were they asked if they understand the concept of TCI? Because I find the general public does not. So were these people who were familiar with this concept, or I'd be interested in polling results that showed how many people even understand what we're talking about.
Yeah, that's a great question, Bob. So to answer your first question, and I'll let my colleagues at Nexus Polling fill in any details. But basically, this is a representative survey. So these were randomized selected people from across the region. No, there was not a screen of asking people, do you know what the TCI is in any detail? I think it's fair to say that most people don't know the TCI by name. But that's exactly why when we ask these questions, and I would point you to in particular the question number 11, and I'll just read it to you because we're trying to, you have to basically give people an idea of what it is that you're talking about. This question says, as you may or may not know, 11 Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states and the District of Columbia have joined together in a regional transportation agreement called the Transportation and Climate Initiative. Under TCI, states will cap carbon pollution from the transportation sector and require gasoline companies to pay for the carbon pollution produced by the fuel they sell by purchasing annual allowances. The proceeds generated by this plan would then be reinvested in cleaner, more efficient, and more accessible transportation options. Do you support or oppose your state participating in the TCI initiative? So anyway, that's the way that you generally have these kinds of issues, because you're right, most people, they certainly don't know the details or sometimes are even aware of specific policy proposals. So that's a pretty standard practice, is to give them some background information as they then give you their judgments.
Great. Thank you for your question, Bob. And let's take our next question, which comes from the Q&A box from Advanced Biofuels USA. That question is, were any questions asked about restricting or prioritizing the funds from TCI for projects that would directly decrease fossil fuel use, such as increasing renewable fuel options at gas stations or increasing renewable power generation?
So that's a great question. I'm trying to think back over all the questions we asked. I don't believe we asked any questions specifically about renewable fuels. So I assume that you mean like biofuels. I don't believe we asked any questions about that. We did ask a number of questions about, at least related to the transition to electric. So support for electric charging station networks and so on. And again, very high support for that. And I don't believe, I just don't believe there was anything else. Phoebe, do you remember any other specific questions that related to renewables?
No, nothing other than just general support for investments in those areas.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you for your question. Before we just want to make sure that reporters on the line have a chance to pose their questions. I want to remind everyone again, if you wish to ask a question, use the raise your hand function and your line will be unmuted when it is your turn to ask a question. As a reminder, the Q&A period is for reporters only. If you're having issues with your audio or the raise your hand function, you may use the text-based Q&A box, and we'll do our best to get to all the questions. While we're waiting for our next question, I just remind everyone that to connect with any of the speakers that you've heard from today, or to get more info, you can contact Alex Frank at 703-276-3264. His email address is also included in the invitation and registration that you received for this news event. A recording of this news event will be made available online at the Our Transportation Future website. That website is www.ourtransportationfuture.org. You also, if you'd like access to any of the visuals or graphics used during today's presentation, you can contact Alex Frank if you need anything at all. Just checking in to see if we have any additional questions at this moment, which we do not. Oh, actually we do. Our next question comes from Lisa Prevost from Energy News Network. And her question is, returning to the issue of costs, why didn't you at least ask voters if they would support TCI if it resulted in higher gas prices? My question is for the group.
I'll have to turn that over to our colleagues at Climate Nexus. We didn't consider that.
I'm not sure I have much to add there. We didn't consider it. I don't know if anyone on the panel would like to speak to the broader question there.
I can just add on a little bit that, TCI is obviously a carbon pricing system focused on the essential outcome of reducing pollution from the transportation sector. So it's not a clean gas tax, which by contrast would allow states to raise and spend revenue however they like, with no direct transportation or environmental benefits. So as the transportation system reduces carbon emissions, the need for the allowances will obviously decline. And it's not clear what the gas price or pump increase would potentially look like, depending on the design of the program, whatever the cap level is at the state side, but also the broader economic conditions around transportation. COVID-19 is a perfect example of that revenue would not be collected at the same level right now because emissions are down from transportation. So it's a complicated question to put in a poll because it's not a clean, this is what the price would look like at any exact time across the board. I hope that's helpful, and probably why Anthony and Phoebe didn't include it.
Thank you for your question. Why don't we take our next question, which is from Jim Cameron at the Connecticut Post. Jim, if you don't mind unmuting yourself. You're now live.
Can you hear me now?
We can.
Excellent. Great. Thank you for taking the question. I got to go back and follow up on what the folks in BUR and GBH were asking, and that's the funding question. Did you do any polling on other funding alternatives such as tolls, vehicle miles tax, sales tax increases, or were you only looking at your own funding initiative idea? Thanks.
Yeah, great question. The answer simply is no. We were only looking at the TCI initiative.
Thank you.
Yep.
Great. Thank you for your question, Jim. And I want to remind reporters one last time how they can ask a question before we close today's news event. If you want to ask a question, please use the raise your hand function, and your line will be unmuted when it is your turn to ask a question. As a reminder, the Q&A period is for reporters only. If you're having issues with your audio or the raise your hand function, you may use the text-based Q&A box, and we'll do our best to get to all of those questions as well. But I'm not seeing any additional questions at this time. Well, we just want to make sure you know where you can get more information following today's news conference. To connect with any of the speakers that you've heard from today, you can contact Alex Frank at 703-276-3264 or afrank@hastingsgroup.com. A recording of this news event will be made available online at the Our Transportation Future website. All of the state and regional polling results are now available on that website. The direct link is ourtransportationfuture.org/TCI poll. Also, if you'd like to access any of the visuals or graphics used today, please contact Alex Frank if you need any of those. And I just want to thank all of our panelists today for joining us, as well as the attendees. This news event was sponsored by the Our Transportation Future Coalition. But that concludes today's news event. Thank you everyone for joining.